Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and from this above view you get a sense of what's going on in a lot of my bins. In a lot of my systems I've pretty much gone topless, taking off all the covers, trying to promote drying. In the wintertime, when the furnace was running all the time, the systems all seemed to dry out a lot just from that air circulating all day long, and now that the furnace is not running anymore, things are swinging to the opposite end. Things are a little bit damp, so now I'm trying to see what I could do about keeping things from getting too muddy. The system I want to check in on is the oldest of my systems. It's been 8 days since we checked in on it. It's been 6 weeks since it's been foraging, and foraging just means no fresh feeding. So it went up to day 200 in age, got its 20th and last feeding. Over the past 6 weeks it's just been sitting there. We've checked in on it from time to time, and I was curious to see if perhaps things have matured to the point where we might be able to get out of foraging and get into migration. So we're going to get that system up onto the bench and see how things look. When I set up my migrations, usually I'll put in a little partition wall after I've nudged all the material off to one side, and then I'll build up my feeding area, which is meant to lure the worms over, and I'll put up a little partition wall, but the partition wall will be full of holes to make it really easy for the worms to pass through it, but it'll just help me distinguish between what's on the migration side versus what's on the finished casting side. So I think moisture has been the key reason why we thought the system should just sit and dry with no covers. I guess part of the thinking was that if the material is really damp and comfortable, then the worms will have virtually no reason to want to leave it. Is this one of the dreaded tea bags? Every time we bump into one, we fish it out. And last time I think we collected a whole bunch of them. Actually, we had them all in a pile in one particular place, so we stumbled on them pretty readily. But if we stumble on these, we're going to take them out. I put tea bags in here long ago, and the worms made their way into the bags. They ate all the leaves, obviously. But the bags themselves don't seem to be made out of an organic material that the worms would also eat, so they're coming out when I find them. So these are the African night crawlers that came from Emily, the crazy worm lady, many years ago. There have been times when I think there have been times when I would split the population into multiple containers just so I wouldn't kind of have all my eggs in one basket type thinking. But one way or another, I've sort of ended up again with all of these particular African night crawlers in a single bin of their own. And if anything were to go bad in here, then this would be the only place that I had them, and it would be a complete loss. So sometimes when I look at the population in here, I wonder to myself if it would be possible to take these little guys and launch off more than just one bin when it's time to move them. And I think it might be time to move them soon, because there's just basically nothing left in this system for them. No bedding, no food. I'm not 100% certain of what I just removed, but they did sort of look like tea bags. And even though we took out probably at least half a dozen of them already in the past, or more, who knows, maybe even 10, that looks like it was another 2 or 3. Yeah, these castings really are very nice, and even though they do appear to, I don't know what it looks like on the video, but it, probably appears to you that they all crumble very loosely and very nicely, and they do. And the only thing about them that's a little deceiving is just how damp they are, because they don't look that way, I'm sure, on the video, the way they crumble and flow, but they're super damp. And I'm sure the worms really enjoy being in them too. And it's really that dampness that makes me wonder if I'd have any luck baiting the worms, luring them out of this stuff, since it is so damp and cozy. I don't know, I just keep trying to talk myself out of it, it seems, based on that one criteria. Telling me that, hey, if the stuff was getting pretty dry, then you'd also have a bunch of really heavily motivated worms that would probably want out of this stuff on their own with minimal, coercion. coercion's the right word, perhaps motivation. It kind of makes me wonder, even if the stuff is nice and damp and cozy, maybe it is so depleted of bedding and food that maybe the worms would, eventually venture into a feeding area and stay there. It really looks like it could be possible, after 6 weeks of foraging in this stuff, they've really broken it down to a really nice consistency. No fresh food now. Nothing's been added to this thing for 6 weeks. And the question that remains is, do we start into their migration today, or do we start into nothing? And do we just let this stuff dry further and give them a little bit more incentive to leave when the time comes to try to lure them out? Decisions. It is tempting to just let this stuff sit a little bit longer. I gotta tell you, it is a very, very nice just walking past this bin too and being able to just peek in there and see that just a nice level tub full of beautiful castings. And when I come in here in the evening, when it's a little bit dim, the lighting, I'll only turn 1 or 2 lights on. I can see worms hanging on the surface, so they're always kind of cruising the surface of this material. Even though it's uncovered, it just seems to maintain a nice, comfortable dampness level out on the surface that the worms seem to like, and they just come out and explore on it a little bit in the evenings when it's dark. Yeah, they probably do it during the daytimes too. What do I do? I wonder what you would do. I'm sure people are all just kind of saying, get the migration started already. What the heck are you waiting for? And I could totally see their point. What the heck am I waiting for, right? So why don't I take this piece of cardboard? It looks like it would fit pretty nicely in here. We can nudge all the material aside. I'll make sure this thing's full of holes so that when we set up a nice feeding area, it'll be really easy for them to make their way over into the feeding area through the holes. And then we'll consider foraging in here done after 6 weeks. I've got a feeling the majority of you will agree, so I'll be curious to hear what the comments say. I hope I don't end up doing this with a sea of opposition, but it does certainly seem like we have a pretty good chance at a nice migration happening here, because there is always also that simple fact that this material will just continue to dry, because I will just leave it uncovered the way it is. It'll just be stacked up a little bit higher, pushed off to one edge of the bin. There is quite a bit of material in here. But our feeding zone I don't think needs to be terribly large. So I'm just kind of making a little bit more room on this side than I really need, and then we'll come back and backfill some of the available space after we've set up the feeding zone for these little guys. So I've got all kinds of prepared bedding. I've got some yummy foods up in the freezer we could use to set up this feeding area for them. I've also got that cardboard that I need to perforate with a bunch of little tiny holes. So I think we're going to have a little bit of a break here before we can get started with the assembly of their feeding area with their horizontal migration feeding zone, if we want to use the correct technical term. I'm still so surprised that I keep finding these little tea bags in here. But let's get rid of it. Yeah, we're not going to have things stacked up this high. I mean, I'm really up to the very rim up here. And as far as the feeding zone is concerned, I think it's going to go in here built up slightly dry. My thought was that maybe it could serve as sort of a sponge and start drawing moisture out of these bedding or out of this material to dampen itself. Maybe it is time to replace the plastic covers, and then the plastic covers will simply keep the moisture within the system, and then the system itself will equalize, sending a lot of the moisture that's in this casting material over into the somewhat dry bedding that we build the feeding area with. I don't know if that is how it would work or could work, but it seems like it might be worth a try. So that's what I was kind of thinking about, even though I'm not a big fan of the idea of bringing plastic back to make that happen. I don't know. I guess I'll just ponder that a little bit further before we pull the trigger. It would be nice to be able to continue into the migration with no plastic coverings, allowing the material to dry, allowing it to become such that the worms on their own would like out of it because of that drying. And we don't have to push it, you know, we don't have to come up with some sort of fancy device or system for that to happen. So let's see, something like that, right? That opening there will be enough for us to backfill. We've got to fill all this in. I need some bedding. So let's get to work on collecting all these things I need, and we'll pick up where we left off in a minute. It turned out pretty good. What do you think? All we got to do is rest it in here, sort of, lay in some bedding, and I've got some soiled pieces of paper over there we could use. I've even got some fresh newspaper. And from the kitchen, just so happens that I was visiting at my mom's earlier today. She provided me with some broccoli, some cantaloupe melon rinds. The coffee's from my machine, but these foods here are from my mom. None of it's frozen. I just brought it home from her house. I was just over there for dinner, and the wormies are going to benefit from this. So a lot of times I'll freeze food I'm putting into the worm bins. In this particular occasion, I won't be. If there's a place for it, we can even use some of our worm chow. So let's get this thing set up. My pre-made bedding is going to come in pretty handy here, I believe. I've got it right here on standby. I've also got a few pieces of newspaper. I thought we'd start by building out the feeding area, or the horizontal migration feeding zone, whatever you want to call it. The whole idea is that you're migrating, so to me it's more of a migration zone than a feeding zone. Because if it doesn't migrate the worms, then it was a failure, because they never even came over to feed on what you have. So at some point here, we'll be able to let go of this piece of cardboard. It'll be able to stand in place just based on some of the backfilled castings we place against it on one end, and then these pieces of cardboard and paper that we put into the feeding area should help things stand upright, and in can come some of my lovely prepared bedding for these little guys. So now I'm going to start layering things in here a little bit. I thought that up here on this top layer of stuff, we might sprinkle in about half of the coffee I came down here with. And I guess just to draw some attention to it, we can start laying in some of this yummy fresh fruit. For that matter, we can get my worm chow into service here too and start sprinkling it in. So now what do we got left in here? We've got, I guess it never hurts to put a little bit more bedding in here and there. There are a number of just big gaps all over the place here. It's just a bunch of crinkled up paper. We've got some more chunks of cantaloupe we can continue with in here. We've also got all of this broccoli. Might as well just drop it in. Shake out the bag. Yeah, there wasn't much left here, right? Enough cantaloupe to lay out a nice top layer. And I guess we've got room enough for plenty of bedding in here. I kind of like the idea of the feeding area kind of being at the same height or level as the system itself, but I got a feeling once the worms start breaking this stuff down, all this paper starts collapsing under its own weight with all the food and stuff laying on top of it, it's going to become not quite as high as far as its depth anymore, I think. So a lot of times we'll hang on to these coffee filters and use them to mark where we fed, although I think it's going to be pretty easy coming back here later to sort of figure out where we last fed. I don't think it's going to be a big mystery. So I guess what I'm curious of is if we start backfilling things and looking for a point at which things are kind of level, what is the height? It does seem like it's going to be a height that's approximately the top of the cardboard, which works pretty nicely. And there's really no need to really force it. We don't have to reach that level in our feeding area. It could be a little bit underneath. It's fine. There's another tea bag. It's incredible how they keep popping up. Didn't realize there were so many. So these castings are really fine, and they're just going to keep drying, I think, out here as long as we leave them uncovered. And I think instead of trying to hydrate this with recirculating moisture coming off these castings, using plastic to cause that to happen, I think we'll just sort of in part rely on the food that was put in there, right? Because as those foods start to break down, they're going to emit a little bit of moisture and dampen the surrounding materials. The coffee, when it went in, was all damp, so we don't have to worry about that too much. The chow, well, you know, the worm chow was dry, as was the bedding to a certain degree. Well, that's not true. My bedding does have a pretty good moisture content to it. You can kind of tell just from looking at it, it's a little bit darker than as if it were dry. So that is a pretty nice feeding area, I gotta say. And the height of it, it will definitely collapse as the, you know, worms eventually discover it and move in and start breaking this stuff down. And I got a feeling it's going to be a popular spot too, because, you know, fresh bedding, once they stumble on it, I think they're going to really like it. They're going to want to stay. And then I think we'll probably be back in here to check on them a couple more times. Make sure that there's sufficient food in here to keep them coming over and staying. Make sure the bedding that we put in here is still holding up. So that looks pretty good. I can't seem to resist just going for one more handful of my bedding for some reason. I don't know. It just seems like the right thing to do. Keep looking at that level, you know, trying to even them off and get them to the same height, but it's certainly not an important consideration. I think we're done here. Plastic coverings, though, you know, over the feeding area. The feeding area I could see having the tendency to just dry out based on what it's built out of. It's not very well protected against drying out. So here, it certainly would make sense to cover up with some sort of plastic just to make sure we don't end up with a feeding area that's ineffective due to dryness. So let me find something we could put on here. Oh, shucks, these were those pieces of soiled paper that I had hoped to use down here within this feeding area as bedding, but totally forgot. Oh well. I've got one of these plastic bags that are pretty good in size. It was in use elsewhere in another of my systems. I took it out of service yesterday, but it's right here handy. It's even still a little bit soiled, so we don't have to worry about cleaning it up, so we can put it away. We can just put it right back into service, soiled just the way it is. I think it'll be just fine. I'm just wondering if prior to covering things up here, maybe we would benefit from the application of just a little bit of water. And in this case, the water I'm spraying also has a little bit of that MOSQUITO Dunks BTI solution in it. So I think between the dampening, between the fact that the bedding itself is already a little bit damp, the coffee's a little bit damp, and the fruits and veggies we're putting in here also bring with them a little bit of moisture, I think we'll be in pretty good shape over here. I'm even wondering if when I cover up, I might be able to sort of feather the covering a little bit over the bedding of the finished castings, and perhaps a little bit of that recirculating moisture idea that I had could actually be applied here, so that not only is it holding in the existing moisture that it's got, but a little bit of the moisture that's coming off the material on this overlap can also hopefully recirculate down into the feeding area, making it into a really nice comfortable spot that the worms are going to want to come over to. So that's where we stand now. This is my 242-day African nightcrawler system, now transitioning from foraging to migration, and I'll be curious to see what it takes to get the little guys to come over here. Hopefully it won't take too long. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go, and if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.